I got interested in this because while there are tons of history books, I think few focus on how diseases, especially pandemics, have driven human history. And so that's a unique angle that I think you took with this.
Yeah, and I think, my background's in history and sociology. And I guess, a couple of years ago, I came to the realization that in many ways, we're still very much stuck in the age of the Old Testament. If you go back to your Genesis, where God supposedly created humans in his own image and then gave us dominion over the land, the sea, and all the animals in it. And we still seem to think very much about the world in that way. We see the world as a stage on which humans, whether that's great men and women or classes that are struggling, play out our roles. And we see the natural world as just a blank canvas. But actually, the more I read about science and the science of diseases and pathogens and microbes, I realized that, the world isn't a stage. The natural world isn't a stage. We live in a system, an ecosystem, and we're a relatively small part of that. And, you can measure the importance of microbes or pathogens in many, many different ways. And I can just throw out a few factoids that I think might blow your listeners' minds to start with, because they certainly did for me when I was researching the book. One is that if we were to take all the bacteria on our planet and weigh them, their mass would be about 1,000 times more than all the humans. So despite the fact that these things are so small, they're invisible to the naked eye, there's so many of them that they weigh 1,000 times all the humans. And another crazy fact relates to viruses, which tend to be even smaller. If we were to take all the viruses on the planet and put them end to end, apparently, according to an article in Nature Microbiology, they would reach for something like 100 million light years, which is just kind of it's just a mind-boggling figure. But I guess the research that really got me into this was not about the numbers. It was about the actual impact that these microbes have on our bodies. And we can look at the impact of viruses, say, on human evolution, which again is really, really, really surprising. I think your listeners might be shocked by it. So there are a particular type of virus called retroviruses, and they reproduce by basically inserting a copy of their DNA into our DNA. But when they infect the cells, our reproductive cells, so either our sperm cells or our egg cells, something really, really remarkable happens. Basically, the DNA from the virus gets passed down to our children and our children's children, and so on. And when scientists have looked at
that's kind of gross, actually. But go ahead, continue. That gross, that skeeves me out a little bit.
It gets grosser. I'm telling you.
Yeah, I bet it does.
So about
continue.
About 8% of all the DNA in our genome comes from these viral infections, which is surprising. But then we humans seem to have acquired functions from these viruses that are really important to human existence. So one example is the ability to form memories. So the way in which kind of information passes between brain cells is very similar to the way that the viruses pass their DNA from one cell to another. And when scientists looked at the gene that codes for this in humans, they found that it was inherited from a viral infection that occurred maybe 400 million years ago.
Wow. What? So we have memory because an early ancestor of Homo sapiens got a virus.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. And scientists have managed to breed, I think mice or rats without this particular gene. And these rodents aren't able to learn things and don't seem to be able to remember things. So it's really kind of mind-boggling. But my favorite one is probably the ability to have children through kind of live birth. Also seems to have been, at least in part, made possible by one of these retrovirus infections that occurred something like 180 million years ago. So the kind of the substance that binds the placenta to the uterus in the female body is very, very similar to the substance that viruses use when they're trying to enter a cell without being detected by the immune system. And this might sound surprising, but actually it shouldn't be, because the placenta is really a remarkable organ, because it allows basically a genetically distinct object to form a bond with the host. And in most situations in nature, if something tried to do that, it would be destroyed by the immune system. But
right, it's a parasitic relationship.
But because our bodies have copied or have borrowed this technology, I guess it's kind of prehistoric biohacking in a way.
Sure.
From viruses, they're able to overcome that problem, and kind of being able to carry your young in your womb for 9 months is a real evolutionary advantage, right? It's much safer than laying some eggs somewhere and then maybe running away when a lion comes and roars at you or something. So really mad. But there's
Wait, let me get this straight. So basically, if humanity hadn't been infected with this retrovirus, so in early ancestor of humanity, humans would reproduce by laying eggs as well?
Yes. So if a shrew-like kind of animal hadn't been infected by this virus about 180 billion years ago, we would be laying eggs, or we would be born from eggs, which is it's hard to get your mind around.
Wow. It is. So we're not talking about like a humanoid type of thing. We're talking about an early mammal.
Yeah, it's a long time ago.
Yeah,
and so yeah, this is the beginning of mammals, really. But we don't have to go back all this far. I think another bit of research, another study that really kind of encouraged me to look at the impact of infectious diseases on society was by some Belgian scientists. And basically what they did was they took the feces of 2,000 Belgian people rather than me, and they looked through it and they tried to sequence the DNA of all the bacteria in the feces, and they found some pretty remarkable things. First of all, they discovered basically that the bacteria in our gut, or something like 90% of the bacteria in our gut, is capable of producing neurotransmitters, so chemical messengers like dopamine, serotonin, that are capable of influencing human moods. And this kind of really raises the question why. And it seems like over millions of years, these bacteria have evolved to communicate with us, because perhaps they realize that if we're more gregarious, if we're happier, we're going to go out, we're going to socialize, and we'll provide opportunities for these bacteria to colonize another body. And another part of this study looked at people that were suffering from...
I'm trying to think about how that might happen. Like, hey, let's make him happy so he goes to this party, ... your poop gets into somebody else's body. It's like, what kind of parties were they having back then?
Well, I guess
that allowed that to happen.
That was the days before germ theory, so people weren't washing their hands. And
right. No, that all makes...
So...
unfortunately makes too much sense. Yeah, that's really really gross. Imagine that research study though, man. How did this Barbie doll head get in here? I don't know. There's a lot of filtering through feces. That's an unfortunate position as a research student, as a PhD student. Like, you're going to be spending the next 3 years digging through other people's poop, but it'll be interesting.
Yeah,
we promise.
That's not for me. I guess they got their rewards in the end. They got an article. I can't remember if it was Nature or Science, but it's a pretty shitty way to do it. Excuse the pun.
Yeah.
But what was really interesting as well with this study was that they basically found that people in the sample that had been diagnosed with clinical depression were lacking in a couple of types of bacteria, which and these bacteria were capable of producing neurotransmitters like dopamine. So again, this is really it's really fascinating, and one because it makes you wonder, perhaps in the future therapy or Prozac won't be the best way to treat clinical depression. Perhaps having some kind of fecal transplant will be even better. But it's, I mean, just this whole kind of study, and there's loads of stuff. I mean, I'm sure you've had guests on talking about the microbiome and the fact that there are more bacteria in our bodies than there are human cells, and that
a little bit. I guess you're right. It's only a matter of time till you're not taking the pill orally, but you're putting it in your backside, and it's hopefully that's all it is, and then it's colonizing your gut, with something. Because I'd wager most of the things you take orally just never make it that far because of stomach acid and other digestive processes.
Yeah, exactly. They just get kind of destroyed on the way through. And this got me thinking, if bacteria and viruses have such a big impact on our bodies, on us as individuals, what kind of influence do they have on, kind of aggregations of bodies, on society, on history, on economics, on politics? So all this research about pathogens and microbes, this really kind of got me thinking about history and society in a totally new way. And I guess it was also, the fact that we were living through a pandemic at the time, which got me wondering about that as well.
Is pathogenesis a real word, or is it just a catchy portmanteau of pathogen and genesis?
No, it's a real world. So, sorry, I'm just gonna have a sip of.
Sure. Yeah, it's funny you made the exact same mistake as me.
Yeah,
because I would have looked it up before the show. I should have, but it just occurred to me that maybe that's not an actual word.
No. So, I mean, my background isn't in medicine, but I found myself teaching in a medical school, teaching public policy and public health. And, certainly people in the medical school study pathogenesis. So that's, this is going to test my Greek, but patho is kind of disease, and genesis is the creation. So pathogenesis is basically kind of looking at the way in which diseases develop, usually in cells or in the body. But I guess kind of it's a play on words, the title of the book, in the sense that I look at the way in which diseases, kind of create new societies or new opportunities for different exciting ideas to emerge out of the chaos that they create.
The Black Plague and other pathogens have killed so many people, and you mentioned that those who survived had genes that gave them a stronger immune response or boost when faced with this pathogen. So it almost seems like this whole hubbub about alpha males, natural selection, eat or be eaten or whatever, it seems like actually it comes down to immunity instead of being a tough guy.
Yeah, exactly. That's
in many ways, at least at the macro scale.
Now, that's a funny thing because, we think about this kind of Darwinian idea of survival of the fittest as being about, kind of being able to fight other men or being able to fight off other alpha or other apex predators, your lions or your tigers or whatever. But when you actually look at what have been the biggest causes of death, certainly over the last kind of 10,000 years since the transition to agriculture, it's been infectious diseases. And so the capacity to survive infectious diseases is kind of really a massive survival advantage. And I guess the kind of weird thing with that as well is that although often we can have genes that confer a survival advantage on us in the face of infectious diseases, frequently these genes actually interfere with the normal functioning of the body. So the classic example here is with sickle cell anemia, which is really effective in places where malaria is endemic at stopping the plasmodium kind of making you really sick. But the kind of downside of that is that it creates all sorts of complications in your body that kind of really create debilitating pain and really, really unfortunate. And this happens this is just the kind of worst and most famous example, but this happens in multiple other cases with other infectious diseases that, kind of a successful ability to or a successful immune response is also kind of leads to some other negative aspect in the human body. So although we're fit to fight diseases, in many ways we're less kind of well functioning human beings.
So if viruses and bacteria are able to transfer genes to humans or pre-humans, were they also able to transfer DNA to, well, actually they're transferring DNA, right? Not diseases. Well, they do both actually. But let me backtrack that and say if the bacteria and viruses are able to transmit or transfer DNA to humans, were they able to do that with each other as well? Can bacteria and viruses either interspecies or within their own species, can they transfer that DNA? How do they get it?
Yeah, so bacteria are really kind of remarkable because certainly they're able to engage in kind of the horizontal transfer of genes between species. So again, this is a kind of, I guess, a form of biohacking in nature, and again, something that really kind of shows you the limitations of the Darwinian model of evolution through natural selection. That one strain of bacteria can immediately acquire certain genes that provide it with advantages. And I think the interesting thing about this is that it helps us to understand why antimicrobial resistance is such a big problem, right? We're kind of we're in this, or we have been for ever since we've been on the planet, in this battle with bacteria, and they're inside us, all around us, and many strains of bacteria are evolving in ways that harm us. But they have kind of a variety of advantages. One, they reproduce much quicker than us, and two, they're able to kind of horizontally transfer genes between species, which makes it a pretty unfair fight in some respects.
When you say horizontally transfer DNA, do you mean that if there's a bunch of, let's make like a human analogy. If I'm a bacterium and I'm in the room with a bunch of other bacteria, can I say the equivalent of, wow, it's amazing, you're not killed by UV? I kind of want that special power. Can you give that to me? And then I get injected with that. And I'm like, thanks, bro. Is that the dumb bro version of how this happens? No. Or is it more generational?
I think that's pretty accurate. Ed Yong, who, the brilliant science writer, he kind of describes it as being as easy as exchanging phone numbers. So I think your analogy is pretty spot on.
Wow. I'm shocked that I got that even remotely close, because it sounded stupid before I said it, and definitely sounded stupid afterwards. That's incredible, because they can almost sort of naturally select in real time, right? Oh, there's chemicals here that are not good for me. Oh, you don't seem to be affected by this. Give me that. It's like handing out gas masks in a room where there's a toxic gas, or handing out sunshades because there's UV. It's just, but all almost in real time. Otherwise, because the bacteria, what do they live, a few hours or days or whatever a lot of the time? So that's an amazing ability that is shockingly sophisticated for something that is so tiny and so basic and millions or hundreds of millions of years old. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's totally incredible, as you say. So yeah, kind of, I guess the closest thing to the horizontal transfer of genes in humanity is kind of when we look back at the interrelation between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals 100,000, 50,000 years ago. And, kind of, you've probably kind of, or certainly some of your readers, some of your listeners will know that, humans have certainly something like 2% of their genes comes from Neanderthals, at least if we're of European or Asian origin. Native Americans as well. People of African origin have significantly less, but still some. And we've known this since about 2010, when Svante Pääbo, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine last year, managed to basically kind of work out the genome of Neanderthals, and found that actually we were pretty closely related to Neanderthals, and we shared lots of genes with them. But the thing to remember is this 2% of genes. They're not randomly selected genes. They're ones that provided our distant ancestors with a survival advantage as we were pushing out of Africa between 150,000 years ago. So we would have evolved for hundreds of thousands of years in tropical Africa, and would be used to that kind of climate and that disease environment. And as we were pushing up through the Middle East into northern Eurasia, it was cold, it was dark, but also we were coming across different infectious diseases, and infectious diseases that were carried by other species of humans like Neanderthals, which had evolved in Europe and in other parts of Eurasia. And so I guess kind of the thing to remember is when we first came into contact with Neanderthals after perhaps our ancestors being separated for 500,000 years, it was probably really devastating. We were coming across new infectious diseases that we had no immunity to, and the same for the Neanderthals. And so probably in the first interactions we would have met, we don't know what happened. We know that we know that some of our ancestors had sex because we can still see the artifact of those trysts in our DNA. But it's also very likely that we got sick, and a lot of people got very, very ill or died. And the interesting thing is that it doesn't seem like we kind of evolved through natural selection better immunity. We just acquired wholesale these genes from Neanderthals.
That's interesting.
So this is the point. This is the poison antidote model.
Yeah.
The Neanderthals give us the poison in the sense that they have these infectious diseases that are making us really ill, but they also provide us with the antidote in the sense of the genes that they've evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. So again, it's like another prehistoric form of biohacking where we can kind of take wholesale these genes.
So somebody took one for the team in a big sort of immunity boosting way for the rest of humanity.
Several people in the history,
several million possibly, doing this. So okay, if humans and Neanderthals shared these immune defense plans, or so to speak, along with the actual diseases, why did humans, or Homo sapiens, I probably should use the actual term here, why did Homo sapiens prevail? Is it because we're smarter? Is it because we had language? Is it because we had better social structures? Because it seems like they had better immunity, or did they just have different immunity?
They had different immunity. So we were trying to push into a new disease environment, and they were suited to that, and we weren't. But yeah, it's a really interesting question. Why did Homo sapiens survive and Neanderthals disappear? And the traditional argument is that we were smarter than them. And, this argument is even inherent in the name that we give ourselves, right? We call ourselves Homo sapiens, wise man, wise humans. And in fact, certainly there was a zoologist in the 19th century, just after Neanderthals had been discovered, who suggested calling them Homo stupidus. So stupid humans, to distinguish between the wise and the stupid species of humans. But the more that we learn about Neanderthals, the more that we realize that they weren't these kind of brutish cavemen. And there's been some really fascinating archaeological discoveries in the last few decades. So we know now that Neanderthals buried their dead. They might have even buried their dead by putting flowers on top of the graves. There seems to be some evidence of that, although that's questionable. We know that they looked after their sick because, kind of evidence of Neanderthals that were really badly injured in childhood who survived for decades have been found. We know they were capable of traveling by boat in the Eastern Mediterranean, that they used medicinal herbs to treat various maladies. We know that they talked, they used fire, they painted cave walls, not as beautifully as some of the cave paintings that occurred a bit later, like Lascaux, but still they were interested in these aesthetic concerns. And
I'm shocked they made boats. I hadn't heard that. I had no idea about that. That's really interesting.
Yeah,
incredible. Actually.
Yeah. So basically, anthropologists, archaeologists have found evidence of Neanderthals in islands certainly around Greece, that were islands kind of 50,000, 100,000, 150,000 years ago. So there was no other way that the Neanderthals could have got from the kind of landmass of the old world to these islands without going by boat. So yeah, really, really quite amazing. And it kind of builds up this picture of a species that isn't that different to us. So yeah, kind of the question is, why did we survive and they didn't? And the answer is pretty simple, really. We or Homo sapiens had been living in tropical Africa, and if we go back to our kind of basic physics biology, if you're closer to the equator, more sun hits the earth, so you tend to have more vegetation, more animals living on that vegetation, and more microbes living on the vegetation and the animals. So Homo sapiens, when they were pushing out of Africa, they carried more and more deadly infectious diseases. And so we overcame the disease burden of Neanderthals quicker than they overcame ours. And so we were able to kind of basically push through into Eurasia with immunity and spread throughout the world pretty quickly.
Now, the agricultural revolution, we humanity, Homo sapiens, switch from. Sorry, this is going to remain clunky, folks, because I should probably use these technical terms here, or these scientific terms, just to avoid confusion. But the Homo sapiens switch from hunting and gathering to essentially agriculture and farming. What does this do for diseases, and why?
Yeah, so this is a really important development in the emergence of infectious diseases, because for the first time in history, humans are living in close proximity to one another, but also in really close proximity to animals, both farm animals and also the kind of parasites that live on those animals and the various kind of rodents and things that are attracted to grain. So all of a sudden you have kind of these, well, Jim Scott, the Yale-based anthropologist, refers to them as multi-species resettlement sites. So basically, all of a sudden, humans are living cheek by jowl with animals of various sorts, which creates new opportunities for infectious diseases, zoonotic diseases, to jump from one species to the other. And we're also living close to one another, and we're trading with people in far-flung destinations. So this creates the ability for these diseases, once they've jumped the species barrier, to spread quickly through the village and then spread along trade routes. And this is when you get the emergence of infectious diseases as we now know them. So I think it's really interesting to think that we certainly wouldn't be here chatting on Skype or Zoom if this kind of transition from hunter-gathering to settled agriculture hadn't have happened. In some respects we can argue that it's a good thing, because it's brought us kind of civilization, or whatever we think of as civilization. But we should also remember there's a kind of dark side to this as well, and that's the emergence of infectious diseases, this kind of real golden age for microbes. And whether you look at the genetic data or you look at kind of art history, it's clear that many of the infectious diseases that have really devastated humanity for the last few thousand years emerged in the wake of this transition to agriculture. So things like the plague, smallpox, polio, they all seem to have emerged after the transition to agriculture.
Huh. Yeah, it all makes sense, right? Instead of just walking around and setting up camp and picking berries and hunting the occasional animal with your small tribe, now you're living in a small town or whatever a city was at that time, a few thousand people, and you're living with, I don't know, what do they domesticate early? Pigs and things like that. And then you've got rats, and then you've got fecal matter on the ground from humans and animals that the rats are getting into, and then they're biting you when you sleep. I mean, that all just seems like a giant cesspool, petri dish of new diseases that humans had never seen.
No, exactly. And I guess like the scary thing is we can also make a comparison to today, right? I mean, I don't want to jump too much back and forth between the present day and the distant past, but in a way it seems.
I think we can follow it. I think we can. I think we're smart enough to be able to follow the timeline.
Yeah,
here,
I think
back and
we're
forth.
living in a new kind of golden age for infectious diseases now, right? You know, I think probably before COVID, a lot of us wanted to ignore this fact, but the unprecedented size of the world's population, the fact that we live so closely together, that we're encroaching on animal habitats, just the industrial scale of factory farming, not to mention the fact that we can travel so quickly between, really distant parts of the world. This creates the perfect conditions for new pandemics to emerge and to spread really quickly. So it's interesting to see that we're in almost kind of the golden age for infectious diseases 2.0, and to look at the parallels between the kind of transition to agriculture and then whatever we're living in now, the industrial or post-industrial age.
It is a vulnerable feeling, and you're right. I was going to mention that you could go on a trip to the Amazon jungle for 2 weeks. I did that a few years ago and end up in the middle of absolutely nowhere, sleeping at a far-flung science research station. In the longest part of the journey is the boat ride and the bus ride through the jungle. The plane ride is shorter, right? And that's kind of scary because that means you've gone really damn far into the middle of areas where there aren't even really humans other than uncontacted tribes that are staying well away from this. And you're getting bit by sandflies. There was a guy on our trip, I've said this on the show before, I'll keep it short. There was a guy on our trip that got leishmaniasis on his face, which is a flesh-eating bacteria. And it's gross. At least we knew what it was, but there's probably other stuff out there that we are not quite sure what it is. And some unlucky tour guide or tourist or whatever is going to end up with it at some point.
Yeah, no, it's nasty to think about, but I guess kind of counterintuitively, or maybe not counterintuitively, but I think kind of we have to worry about that, but also just the size of farms and the people that kind of work in farms and the opportunities that creates for diseases to jump from one species to our own. It's pretty freaky too. But scientists have calculated something like there's a 2 to 3% chance of a COVID strength pandemic happening every year, which, it sounds okay if you take it year by year, but when you kind of think cumulatively that in 25 years time, there's a kind of 50-50 chance of another massive pandemic occurring. It's pretty sobering.
Yeah, especially since a lot of people like my age are going to be the age that people died when they got COVID or slightly younger. And this could be a worse pandemic. So it's like, oh man, maybe we're going to end up with something way worse when I'm in a much more vulnerable position in terms of my immunity. Not super comforting at all, for that matter. And it's also, looking at our reaction, it's a little scary because 25 years sounds like a long time, but are things really going to get that much better? I don't know. I'm not sure.
I guess the thing to remember is we're in a better position than we ever have been. Kind of COVID was terrible and it killed millions of people and, caused just almost unimaginable disruption. But it was really remarkable, almost miraculous how scientists got together, shared information about the disease, created several effective vaccines within, a year and rolled it out really, 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 really quickly. And so I think kind of, certainly enormous amounts of money are being put into medical research. Some of the things that they will be capable of doing in 25 years are going to be, beyond our imagination now. So we can perhaps be a little bit, if not confident, there's reasons to be hopeful as well.
Yeah, indeed. I'm trying to be more of an optimist, but yeah, it's just scary that you can have a pandemic and then, we're probably going to have another one, because our parents didn't really have to deal with that at all, right? I mean, the last big one was sort of flu was what, 1918, Spanish flu? Yeah,
well, I think the thing is that, antibiotics and vaccines basically kind of, they created a really exceptional period of time in the second half of the 20th century and the first couple of decades of the 21st. It kind of brought us this kind of really, really incredible reprieve in the age-old battle against infectious diseases that maybe lulled us into a false sense of
I think so.
security. But yeah, certainly our parents were really incredibly lucky in many ways. But medicine was another reason to be happy.
You mentioned in the book that many more child skeletons were found after humans settled, and that tells us that there were more diseases that affected us in childhood. But, and I'm sure they've controlled for this, but I'm curious how. Is that really because of disease, or is that because we can simply find those skeletons because they're in ancient settlements? It seems like if you're hunter-gathering and your child dies in the middle of the Eurasian steppe and you bury them in a shallow grave because you're moving along, like, we're just never going to find those. So is it kind of like a selection bias, sampling bias in a way?
That's a great question. And thinking back to the study, basically what the scientists show is that it seems like for about 500 to 1,000 years after the transition to agriculture, more or less anywhere in the world, you see a boom in population. The numbers of people living seem to expand massively. And then after about 500 to 1,000 years, you seem to have the emergence of infectious diseases. So they've measured this by showing that you have a kind of a really distinct increase in the number of children and adolescents in cemeteries after about 500 years from the transition to agriculture. So, of course, when you're looking in the distant past, it's really hard to be certain, and you're piecing together, different bits of evidence. But you obviously, there's an element of guesswork. But that study seems pretty robust to me, and it kind of it fits in with a lot of recent studies. Sorry, and kind of we could just take an example. A couple of weeks ago in the UK, scientists managed to find the oldest evidence of plague ever. So this was in Somerset in the south of England and in Cumbria in the north, and this was basically kind of 4,000 years ago, so almost exactly 1,000 years after the transition to agriculture. And so yeah, you seem to see this kind of more or less everywhere that you look, this kind of increase in mortality due to infectious diseases becoming endemic, right? Because the adult population have either died in childhood or developed resistance, and so it's the young people who are dying.
Yeah, that does make sense. I'm just never going to assume that I thought of something after reading 3 lines in a book that the scientist who did the entire study, that hadn't occurred to the world-renowned expert on this particular thing. I'm just always curious how they control for that sort of thing when it's almost like, what's that fallacy, post hoc ergo propter hoc, right? Like the correlation versus causation, or like sampling bias just seems like a really low-hanging fruit. Or like, oh, we're finding all these skeletons in ancient settlements that have cemeteries, and we're not finding them in places that checks notes, don't have cemeteries. Okay, well, duh.
Yeah,
that
no,
makes sense.
You're right to raise these questions, but I really must say, having written this book that really tries to summarize and bring together a massive amount of information and a massive amount of evidence from all these different academic disciplines, kind of archaeology, genetics and things. I was really kind of, it's really incredible how much these researchers can tell from just a few clues, and how they can kind of make these logical inferences. It's really kind of really impressive. They're almost like alchemists. They can kind of turn a few fragments of bone into kind of this wonderful new knowledge. It's really incredible.
It is. It's like Sherlock Holmes, right? Like, look at this fragment of bone. This is from a femur, and you can tell that this person had some sort of neurodegenerative disease because this length would have been longer in a normal person of this age. Therefore, they must have had this type of disease, and it looks like they were this age, so that must have been this particular one. It's just really, it's like watching Sherlock Holmes, but with with actual science. It's really incredible. That's why I love books like this and really love science like this. Thanks for watching on YouTube. Remember, you can also enjoy The Jordan Harbinger Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Our podcast feed is a treasure trove of insights from intellectuals, authors, spies, artists, athletes, pioneers, engineers, former mafia bosses, and business leaders, all sharing their secrets to success. For more information, click the link in the description. Now, back to the show. And in the book, you mentioned a lot about the Neolithic farmers bringing disease to hunter-gatherers, and there's really fascinating evidence for how these populations spread. One really cool example for the language nerd in me, which was that Farsi, so Persian, and European and other languages all have similar words for wagon and wheel and, I don't know, like other vehicle parts, suggesting that the migration of those populations happened after wheeled vehicles were invented. And that, I don't know why that's so damn fascinating, but it really, really is, because just to know that these languages that you think probably have almost nothing in common, it's like, well, actually, they're all from the same ancestor language. And look, the word for wheel is so close, you can tell right away that this is the same was at one point the same population of people.
Yeah, I love reading about that stuff as well. And I guess kind of there's been a mystery ever since people realized the connection between English and Greek and Russian and languages like Hindi or Sanskrit, that they're from the same language group, kind of why is this and what's the origin of this? And there's this assumption that, kind of what we call Proto-Indo-European started off being spoken by a small group of people somewhere in the world or somewhere in Eurasia. And then at some point in history, they spread to Europe and they spread to Central Asia and even to South Asia and brought their language with them. And then gradually over time, these languages became more and more different and basically evolved into the tongues that people that speak today. But it's only the last few years that scientists have really understood what the actual source of Indo-European languages is. And it seems to have happened about kind of 5,000 years ago, when you have this massive movement of people from the steppe, so the kind of the vast grasslands of kind of what we say beyond kind of Europe, in southern Russia, above the Black Sea, going all the way to China, basically. There was this big movement of people out of the grasslands, and they swept across Europe. And we can map this kind of by looking at the DNA of skeletons, how they moved across Europe. And this movement of people happens as wagons and horses were also introduced into Europe. And so we can infer from this that this population movement was responsible for the spread of Indo-European languages. But interestingly, there's kind of a few language isolates in Europe, so languages that aren't related to any like other.
Basque and Hungarian.
Yeah, so Basque seems to be the language that was spoken by the people that lived in Europe before this big movement of so-called steppe herders from. So yeah, this is another kind of interesting artifact.
That's I didn't really think about that. I just thought a specific population had either evolved their own language or moved to that area, but actually it's the equivalent of having a state in the United States that speaks, I don't know, Apache Native American language entirely. It's because they just somehow managed to not get overtaken by the Neolithic farmers and who had wagons. Do they live in mountains or something? How come they survived and nobody else seems to have preserved their language and culture? Yeah, the Basque Country is pretty mountainous. It's kind of the border of Spain and France, and so yeah, they seem to have managed to avoid
the pressures to speak this new language. But
Yeah,
really
too much. There's a massive historical advantages to being a really big pain in the ass to either invade, conquer, or travel through, right? It's just, if you live on the edge of something and you're really high up or really far down, it's like, I'm not going all the way up there just to oppress people. I've got enough slaves or labor or animals or resources down here. I'm not climbing all the way up there. The book has a lot of different sort of historical plagues and as almost landmarks in history, ancient Greece, between the power balance between Sparta and Athens. I'd love to skip ahead, though, to the Roman Empire, because you've got the Antonine Plague, and you describe the Roman baths and sewage system, which is just a marvel of the entire world, right? The aqueducts and the fact that they had this massive sewage system and the bathhouses and the water coming in. So it's simultaneously one of the coolest inventions in history, but also super revolting. I mean, it's just absolutely a miracle that any of those people survived having that kind of system in place, because as disgusting as it is really, it does show you how resilient humans can be, but man, is it gross. Can you speak to that a little bit? Like I said, it's a miracle anybody made it out of there alive.
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, I guess when you travel to Rome or former Roman cities today, you see the infrastructure that they built. If you go to Rome, you can still see evidence of the baths and the aqueducts that brought kind of this enormous amount of fresh water flowing into the city. And it seems like, yeah, it must have been a pretty clean place. But actually, when you think about it, when you look at the evidence, it was pretty gross. So people would go to these communal baths. Sometimes they had the capacity for several thousand people. It's not clear how often the water was changed, and the bathers certainly didn't use soap. They maybe used a bit of olive oil. But yeah, the baths would be kind of would have a fair amount of kind of fecal matter and other stuff. I mean, it would be pretty.
Can you imagine how they smelled too? I mean, all the BO from all the people, and yeah, no soap. Didn't they rub olive oil on and then basically scrape it off right into the water too? So there's just this.
Yeah,
I don't even
no, exactly. And something even grosser, perhaps, is the communal toilets. So again, you can still see these communal toilets in various places. Some of them are even made of marble. So it's just these big rows of marble with holes in. Over the sewers, and it seems pretty civilized. But then you remember that there's no kind of barriers, so everyone's just sat there doing their business, and there was no toilet paper either. So the Romans had these sponges on sticks that seemed to be shared in the communal bathrooms, which is pretty.
Sorry for anybody who's listening to this over their lunch hour. I was not expecting that. That's so disgusting.
And
can you imagine?
And
don't worry, I'll just wash it off in the bathwater. I'll be right back.
and the sewers weren't great either. So apparently you had kind of regular explosions that would kind of thrust fire and human waste out of the
fire. Because of the gas igniting.
The gas,
my God.
The methane, whatever, and the heat would build up, and then there'd be these kind of periodic explosions that would fire poo out of the toilets
and into the air for everyone to enjoy.
Yeah.
That's really, really, really gross. That's even worse. I thought the shared bathwater thing was gross. That is just the next level disgusting. Wow. So shockingly, they had plagues in the Roman Empire. Can we talk about that? Because you mentioned coin production is kind of almost a barometer of how well the population was doing, and I thought that was also quite fascinating.
Yeah, so I think, maybe we should start with the Pax Romana. So this was this period for about 150, 200 years at the beginning of the first millennium. And it was a time of unprecedented peace, obviously, but also prosperity. Rome was a city of a million people. So, this is perhaps London in the 19th century was the next city to reach this size. It's really remarkable that 2,000 years ago there was a city that was this big. Even if we kind of can be disgusted by the state of the public health. It's still remarkable that you had a city of that size, and you had an enormous amount of trade within the empire, but also, you had trade links with sub-Saharan Africa, with India, and you even had kind of people traveling as far as China in the middle of the 2nd century AD. And I guess kind of so often in the story of this book, progress, technological development improves lives for people, but it also creates the perfect conditions for pandemics. So again, kind of this increased interaction with the wider world, and the basically kind of created opportunities for infectious diseases to kind of travel into the empire from outside that the citizens had no immunity to. And then, of course, because it was such a heavily populated, urbanized, well-connected polity, basically this created really the perfect conditions for infectious diseases to spread. And so you have a couple of really devastating pandemics in the middle of the 2nd century and the middle of the third century. And we can look at eyewitness accounts to understand what was going on. But as you say, one of the really interesting ways that scientists have discovered you can understand what was going on is by looking at ice cores dug in the Arctic, or drilled in the Arctic. And this allows you to go back and look at ice laid down 2,000 years ago and see what the quality of the water and the air was like. And so basically, sometimes scientists really ingeniously have looked at the lead pollution through ancient times. And lead pollution is important because it would be a byproduct of processing silver ore. So when lots of silver ore was being mined and processed and used for creating Roman coinage, then there'd be lots of lead pollution in the ice for those years. But you see kind of an absolute collapse in the middle of the 2nd century AD, and it gets even worse in the mid-3rd century when you have what's called the plague of Cyprian, which seems to cause kind of absolute chaos in the empire. And it does manage to recover, but it's never quite the same again. And this is certainly the kind of the beginning of the end for the Roman Empire as we know it. In big part because the Romans, in their urbanized, populous, well-connected empire, are really badly affected. But then you have these so-called barbarians, as the Romans called them, who were living beyond the borders in conditions that were much less conducive for the spread of infectious diseases. So Rome wasn't just weakened in absolute terms by these pandemics, it was also weakened relative to its neighbors. And this created opportunities for the barbarians to breach the kind of rivers of the north, the Rhine and the Danube, and also to kind of attack from other directions too.
They had some, what was the big one? Hemorrhagic flu. It's like Ebola, right? You're bleeding from your eyes, ears, and nose. I mean, it's really bad. I mean, I think Ebola still kills like half the people it infects, even with modern medicine. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit. I'm not sure.
No, that's about right. So yeah, Karl Harper, certainly the historian, he looks at the eyewitness accounts and cross-references that with modern medicine, and he reckons that the plague of Cyprian was some kind of hemorrhagic fever, something like Ebola, and that's a really, really deadly disease. But it's also interesting, kind of certainly these plagues had a devastating effect on the empire, but they also created opportunities for other ideas to emerge. And it's interesting to think about the impact that the plague of Cyprian seems to have had on religion. So
yes, I'd love to talk about that, because it basically, you have a tiny sect of Judaism, Christianity, that's now over 2 billion people. How did the plague influence this? And I'd like to really break this down so Christians listening can learn about this. I'm not religious, but I would wager that most Christians don't know about this and would find it really interesting, because I'd never heard this in my life.
Yeah, so I think the thing to remember is that Christianity didn't immediately emerge as a empire-wide religion during the life of Christ, or even immediately afterwards. So in the beginning of the 3rd century AD, Christianity was, as you say, still a really small sect of Judaism. It maybe had 100,000 followers out of a population of 70 or 80 million in the empire. So something like Sikhism in the US today, I think, if my calculations are correct. And then all of a sudden, in the second half of the 3rd century, you see the popularity of Christianity absolutely explode. We know this by looking at the numbers of Christian burials in the catacombs of Rome, or by looking at the increased percentage of people who have Christian names in papyrus documents that have survived in the arid Egyptian desert. And then, in 312, Constantine, the Roman Empire, converts to Christianity. And then a decade later, Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And, that's the beginning of Christianity becoming a world religion. It's a really, really important step in the development of Christianity towards something like what we see today. And there's a big mystery. Why did this happen? Why was Christianity not that popular for a couple hundred years, and then very, very popular from the middle of the 3rd century onwards? And I think the most convincing explanation, and this is one that's put forward by a variety of people, certainly Rodney Stark, sociologist, argues this, that basically Christianity provided a much more assuring guidance to life and death during an age of pandemics than paganism did. So paganism had been the great religion of the Greco-Roman world, and they believed that pandemics were caused by angry gods, that it was the arrows of Apollo that kind of made people ill. And pagans also didn't really have a very well developed idea of the afterlife. They thought that the here and now was basically the main show, and there were some vague ideas of what happened afterwards, but it wasn't very, very nice. And then the message of Jesus is really different, right? It's this idea that pain and suffering in this life can help us kind of enter this kind of eternal paradise in the next life. So it all of a sudden provides meaning to what was going on, this kind of horrific sickness that people were experiencing. It was no longer some kind of meaningless anger of God that we couldn't understand. We were suffering for a reason. And I think the other thing is that Christianity really emphasizes the importance of good deeds as a way of gaining favor with God. And so you have these eyewitness accounts of Christian bishops saying how the pagans abandon their dead and try and run away from the plague, whereas the Christians take them in and they care for them. And although, as we said, kind of Ebola and other hemorrhagic fevers, they're really deadly. If Christians were, even giving these sick people water and some food and some shelter, this would have decreased the mortality rate by maybe something like 2/3, I think Karl Harper estimates. So this basically gives Christians the best commercial that any religion could ever have, which is miracles, or let's get miracles in inverted commas. And so this seems to help explain why you have this explosion of interest in Christianity in the second half of the third.
Right. So it not only does it look like it works, but you're like, oh, these people have my back. I should probably join them because my entire family just ran away from me as soon as first my eyes start bleeding and everybody just leaves me behind. It's totally unfair.
Yeah, and you can get it. And you start seeing the plague as a good thing. It's kind of it's testing me. It's testing my faith. I don't need to worry. If I die, I'll end up in a better place.
That's right. You really find out who your friends are when you start hemorrhaging blood from every orifice.
Exactly.
Let's another cheerful topic. How about the Black Death? Right. This started and essentially leads to what we now know as modern capitalism. It really changed the entire world and the economics of Europe at the time.
Yeah. So I think it's important to think what the world was like at the beginning of the 1300s. In certainly Western Europe, you had a feudal system where basically you had the king at the top, and you had these big aristocratic clans that were sometimes warring with one another, that hopefully provided support for the king at various times, and the king would give them the right to kind of control some land, and then those aristocratic clans would give lesser lords the right to control that land and you had this kind of basically pyramid of obligation. It was very much like the Game of Thrones, and this kind of worked reasonably well in a society where politics was very unstable, because basically it allowed people to raise armies, but it was not conducive at all to any kind of innovation. Basically, if you're a lord, you want to spend any surplus that you have on either kind of building up an army or building your castle to defend yourself. And if you don't do that, another lord who spent all his money on his army and his castles will come along and will take your little kind of area of land off you.
So your fiefdom. Your
fiefdom, yeah. And it's pretty similar if you're a peasant, if you're a serf at the very bottom of the pyramid as well. You don't want to invest too much money in, if you're a serf, you want to take a really risk-averse approach, because, if you grow too much, the lord might take all that stuff off you, and you just want to make sure that you have enough to live. So you plant different crops in different places on the estate, and you hope that some of it survives wild animals and bad weather and maybe marauding armies, so you have enough to live throughout the year. So basically, kind of the economy more or less stagnates. You've had no real increase in, you have no real increase in well-being for the majority of the population. Things haven't really got better since Roman times. But then all of a sudden, you have this massive exogenous shock. You have the Black Death. It comes from Central Asia. It spreads throughout Europe. Some estimates suggest that it kills up to 60% of the population in about 8 years.
Oh my God, can you imagine living through that? Holy cow.
Really devastating. And that's not that's terrible, but the thing is that, the plague returned again and again. You had the second plague in 1361 that killed maybe 30% of the population, and it just keeps returning every few decades for hundreds of years. And so the population of Britain doesn't recover to pre-Black Death levels until about the early 18th century. There's this kind of massive demographic scar, and really, really horrific. But the interesting thing is that this provides the impetus to basically revolutionize European society. So certainly you see in England that there's all of a sudden a big struggle between the serfs and the lords, because the serfs all of a sudden realize that land's plentiful and labor is scarce, and so they want better conditions. And the lords fight back. They use their domination of Parliament to pass various laws, laws that basically ban serfs from moving from one manor to another. When that fails, they pass other laws that say that if you move from one manor to another, you can have your forehead branded with the letter F for falsity. I never quite got that, but yeah. And then another interesting law that was passed were kind of sumptuary laws. So basically, they tried to regulate the clothes that people at various in various classes could wear, and even the foods that they could eat. And this basically suggests a period of great kind of social upheaval where the upper classes were really concerned with what was going on, and they wanted to keep the lower orders in their place. But eventually, the Lord's efforts to stop change, to kind of keep back the demographic tides, failed. And about 100 years after the Black Death, basically every serf had won their freedom, and you still continued with this struggle. And basically, the situation that you ended up with maybe 200 years after the Black Death was one in which the lords still owned the land, but they rented it out at market rates to the most entrepreneurial peasants, who basically had big plots, and because it was at market rates, they had to use the latest technology. They had to grow crops that were particularly suited to the climate and to the soil. And so you have this massive boom in agricultural productivity that basically kind of enables the growth of cities, because an increasing proportion of the population are able to live in cities, and even the food prices begin to fall, which means that workers have more money to spend, and this really kind of kickstarts industrialization because they want to spend this money on manufactured goods, so things like textiles. But it also has an impact on colonization because people get a taste for sugar and they increasingly want to spend their money on sugar. So you see the kind of colonization of Caribbean islands and in order to grow sugarcane.
So interesting that a disease kind of kickstarts capitalism. It just killed enough of the labor force that they were like, wait a minute, I have more value than the subsistence. You have to pay me now. No, I'm going to brand your forehead, which, by the way, we should almost edit that out. I don't want to give Amazon any ideas. But the idea that they could try to enforce that was just like a losing battle. If you look at capitalism now, it was a losing battle from the beginning to just try and... I know I'm going to take flack for this. I'm going to get a zillion emails. It really does look like the authoritarian communism that you'd see in like the Soviet Union. No, you just have to work and you just have to take miserable wages and we're just going to do this. And it's like, well, actually, I'm just going to sell things on the black market. I'm going to walk out the back of the factory and it's going to breed corruption. And it just, capitalism, it just sort of finds a way. It's like water in a container with cracks in it. It's really, really interesting. The diseases also seem to have played a role in wars. We didn't touch on the Greek stuff, but at least in the Spanish takeover of South America, I didn't know this, but the Spanish were a relatively small number of troops, which makes sense, right? They came over on boats, but that civilization that they took over was absolutely huge, rivaled those of Europe in many ways, especially in terms of the numbers and population. And history kind of tells you it was horses, or depending on what history you're reading, it might be miracles and horses, or just good old-fashioned racism plays a part too, right? The white man was sophisticated and the locals weren't. They were just naked running around eating berries or whatever. And it's just not true. It really turns out to be germs from the sound of it.
Yeah, I think, that's a really good way of putting it. So, I mean, one point to make is, as you say, there's this idea that the Americas was populated by, kind of a really kind of so-called backward kind of population. But actually, the evidence suggests that there were certainly some really quite advanced civilizations. If we look at the Mexica, the Aztecs, they had this vast island city, Tenochtitlan, which is now the site of Mexico City, that had maybe a population of 100, 200,000 people. So it was perhaps about 4 times the size of the biggest city in Spain at the time, Seville. And eventually Hernan Cortes managed to conquer this great Mexica empire with 1,000 troops, and even accounting for the fact that he had some horses and he had some pretty unreliable guns. It's really hard to explain without, kind of resorting to miracles. But, actually the key factor here seems to be infectious diseases, and smallpox in particular, which devastated the Mexica and then actually raced ahead of the Spanish and ended up kind of causing massive disruption in South America and devastating the Inca Empire, another great, really sophisticated, advanced empire before the Europeans even arrived. And so you get Francisco Pizarro turning up with 168 men and managing to conquer this vast empire of maybe 7-8 million people. I think if you look at what happened in the Americas in the 1500s, it's really shocking. You have first smallpox, then pandemic after pandemic that doesn't affect the Europeans at all, and literally decimates the indigenous population. The population of the Americas at the beginning of the century is something like 60 million, and at the end of the century it's 6 million. And again, going back to ice core data, scientists have noticed a dip in the amount of carbon dioxide in the air in the 16th century, because so many American people died, so many Native American people died, and the proportion of so many Native American people died, they were no longer engaging in this slash and burn agriculture, and so you can actually see this in kind of ice cores, and scientists have even suggested that this led to a fall in the world temperature and contributed to the coldest period of the Little Ice Age. When the Thames in London froze over for several months every winter, and entrepreneurial Londoners built bars and cafes and ice rinks on the river. So this kind of, it's a fascinating story that reminds us of our interconnectedness and the vulnerability of certain populations to infectious diseases.
So we hear about how cold, smallpox, stomach bugs, whatever, killed all these indigenous people who were not used to these germs and had no immunity. But how come it didn't work the other way around? How come the Spanish didn't roll into South America, immediately just get wrecked by some disease that the indigenous people have had endemic for thousands of years already? How come they didn't have a common cold that just decimated the Spanish? Is that just really bad luck for the indigenous people and really good luck for the Spanish? Or does it have to do with the animal herding and things like that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there were certainly kind of urbanized societies in the Americas and societies that engaged in settled agriculture. So there's a question, why did infectious diseases emerge in the wake of the agricultural revolution in Europe, but not so much in the Americas? And the answer is pretty simple, and actually kind of this is one point where Jared Diamond is pretty spot on. He points out that
he wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel, right?
Guns, Germs, and Steel,
among other things.
Yeah. And he points out that there aren't that many domesticatable animals in the Americas. You have Muscovy ducks, turkeys, a few others, llamas, alpacas, and the only ones of these that are herd animals are alpacas and llamas. And herd animals are particularly interesting because that kind of, if animals live in big herds, then it provides opportunities for infectious diseases to kind of emerge and kind of be maintained in the community. But alpacas and llamas, they didn't live in really big herds, and so you don't see the emergence of these kind of Neolithic infectious diseases in the Americas that you see in Europe. But there is maybe one infectious disease that has its origins in the Americas, and that's syphilis, which caused much pain, much embarrassment to medieval Europeans or late medieval, early modern Europeans, but didn't cause the kind of devastation that smallpox or measles or flu caused.
So there were infectious diseases that would have ravaged parts of the population, but it was more like it burns when I pee as opposed to my entire village is wiped out kind of consequences.
Yeah. You can put it.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I'm just an irreverent prick, I think. So your book really does underline the idea that Cortez was losing horribly against the locals, but then smallpox killed something like half the population inside of a few months, or was it a few years? And that level of devastation is really something. It's hard to imagine that level of devastation. How many dead are we talking about? Do you know numbers off the top of your head?
They estimate a third of the population in a few months, but then you have other diseases that cause similar levels of devastation. I think the real important thing to remember is the fact that the Europeans weren't affected, and you can kind of start to imagine the impact that must have had on the indigenous population, right? We must have seemed like we had some kind of superpower, or I guess kind of that our gods were just better than theirs. And this maybe helps to explain why kind of much of Central and South America today are still so religious. The indigenous populations of the Americas seem to really kind of adopt Christianity in such a kind of enthusiastic way, and that enthusiasm endures to this day.
It really, by the way, if you're not eating right now, you can go ahead and Google smallpox and click on images, and you will not like what you see, because smallpox is it's a really disgusting way to go. And to watch like half your population die of this, you would be running to the nearest person who could tell you that it was the fault of having a weak God. I mean, you really would. Actually, though, it wasn't even just the Spanish who defeated the local empire, right? They fought aside rebellious tributaries who later also got killed by smallpox. So it almost sounds like the Spanish were there to, as is sort of typical of colonizers, to loot, steal, stir the pot, and kind of just pick up the pieces from the survivors.
Yeah, the last men standing, and then they built this. They built the colony on the ruins of the empires that they took over, and
quite literally. Mm. Where are you seeing modern examples of diseases altering the course of history, or is it too early to tell? Can you only see these things 500 years later?
If we look at the book, a lot of these examples play out over decades and centuries. But I guess kind of the thing is, history has speeded up quite a lot in the last few hundred years. If we think that it took, kind of a good 18 months for the Black Death to get from Constantinople all the way to Northern Europe in the middle of the 14th century, whereas, COVID, it was discovered in the autumn of 2019, and a couple of months later, it was kind of a real cause for concern. And yeah, it's a fool's errand to predict the future, but I think we are starting to see the long-term impacts of COVID, but also our response to COVID play out, right? I'm certainly not so sure how it is in the US, but in the UK, we have really sky-high inflation at the moment, and this is a kind of large consequence of the government response and the increase in borrowing and the impact that has had on the economy. But there's also, kind of some quite positive impacts of the pandemic. If we look, for example, at the increasing possibilities to work from home, it's been absolutely transformative for so many people. As someone with a young child, it's really kind of made my life so much better that working from home is much more accepted now. But I think
it sounds silly when you say it like that, right? It's like millions dead, sky high inflation, crumbling economy. On the other hand, I can do this interview with no pants on, so I got that going for me. Yeah, you're right. It really does increase the quality of life. In general.
Yeah, for those of us that have survived and that are lucky to have kind of middle class jobs. But there's all sorts of things playing out, and I think we have to wait and see. But I think there's a bigger, it's also played a bigger role in the kind of ideological struggle that we see in the world, right? If we think of the response of the UK and the US, where it was just a kind of liberal, let the virus rip, see what happens. It was pretty devastating, and I wouldn't advocate the Chinese response. That was pretty terrifying as well. It was a really effective way of stopping the disease spread, to have these really strict lockdowns, but it has a massive consequence on all our social lives and on the economy. But certainly I think it kind of made liberal democracies like the US and the UK look a little weak and a little vulnerable. And I think we're seeing that play out in world politics at the moment, with kind of increasing numbers of countries in certainly Africa and other parts of the world looking to China and Russia as their kind of example of what to follow.
Yeah, that will be interesting. And I think from a disease or health perspective, we're likely to see, and this is my sort of uninformed dude bro opinion, I'm wondering what you think, the connection between wealth, poverty, and healthy eating affecting things like life expectancy and frankly, also probably immunity at some level. Because you and I are sitting here on Zoom or the equivalent thereof, squadcast.fm, rep that company. But we're sitting here doing our work as knowledge workers, sitting on our butts at home. There's plenty of people listening to this right now who are like, yeah, easy for you two schmucks to say, I'm in the Amazon warehouse listening to you idiots while I pack your crap. Or I'm serving food for people like you. I can't just sit at home. So, I can't relate. And I understand that. And those people are far more vulnerable to the next pandemic than we will be with the option to just never leave. And those people are the people that have to go pick up my stuff from DoorDash and bring it to my door and leave it there, right? Like they're just completely left out of this. And I feel like that could really play a part in the next one if we're still doing that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's another important lesson in the book that, of course, the COVID pandemic was about the virus, but it was also about the way that we or our societies created conditions for the virus to affect some people much worse than others. So, people in the poorest parts of the country, people with particular jobs, as you point out, people from particular ethnic groups suffered much more than others. And, so these pandemics are a social phenomenon as well as a kind of biomedical phenomenon. We need to remember that. And it's also, that's another reason to be hopeful, right? Because social problems should be easier to sort out. I mean, I talk about this a bit in the book, going back to the 19th century and the way in which kind of urban slums created the perfect conditions for cholera and TB, but eventually politicians got together and they invested in better housing, in better sanitation, in fresh water, and they resolved the problem. And I think, kind of bearing in mind we're living in a new golden age for infectious diseases, a golden age 2.0, then I think, there's an argument that, politicians, society, businesses have to get together again and kind of understand how, the best way to make ourselves resilient to the next pandemic is in part to invest in new medical technology, but also to create a healthier society anyway, a society in which people are going to be able to kind of survive the next pandemic when it comes. And that's, a social and economic, a political issue as much as a medical one.
Thank you so much. Pathogenesis, really interesting history of the world in several diseases. We didn't even talk about, again, ancient Greece. We skipped through Rome quite quickly, but you even get into slavery in the U.S., which I am sort of grateful we didn't have time to touch on, because that's one where I'm like, oh, let's make this not horribly offensive, and you do well in the book, but I'll leave people to it. And thank you once again for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. Fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for checking out this entire episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show. If you're interested in exploring this topic further, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There, we dive even deeper on this and many other topics. In the audio podcast, I also close open loops, cover things discussed off camera, off air, and give some parting lessons from our guest. You can find The Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any podcast app, or at jordanharbinger.com. And also, if you found this episode useful, please share it with those you care about. Last but not least, like, comment, and subscribe.